Hello, everyone. Around here, HOAs don't win, Karens get humbled, and sweet revenge is always on the menu. Hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss how this one ends. I hadn't given much thought to what Uncle Robert might leave behind when he passed. After the funeral, when the lawyer handed me the deed to 3 acres of land just outside Westlake, I tucked the papers away in my filing cabinet and went back to running my business. The property tax bill that arrived 6 months later was my first reminder that I now owned a piece of Texas real estate. My uncle had lived alone on those 3 acres for decades, a solitary man with little connection to the suburban development that had grown up around his land over the years. I remembered visiting him as a teenager, helping him maintain the small shed where he kept his tools, and listening to him grumble about the fancy neighborhood taking over what used to be wide-open country. Between client meetings and the day-to-day demands of keeping my small marketing firm afloat, I didn't make it out to check on the property until nearly 8 months after inheriting it. The spring weather seemed perfect for a weekend drive, and I figured I should at least see what I now owned. The GPS led me through a suburban maze of identical houses until I reached what appeared to be the entrance to a subdivision called Westlake Estates. A tastefully landscaped sign marked the entrance, with flowers and shrubs arranged in meticulous patterns. I drove past it and continued down a well-maintained gravel road that cut between rows of houses until I spotted my uncle's weathered mailbox, still standing at the edge of his property. I parked my truck in front of the small shed and spent a couple of hours walking the property line, finding the survey markers and taking photos with my phone. The well pump looked functional, though I didn't test it, and the shed was packed with Uncle Robert's old tools and equipment. Nothing valuable, but it felt like a time capsule of his practical, no-nonsense approach to life. After making notes about what might need attention on future visits, I headed back to my truck. That's when I spotted the bright orange paper stuck under my windshield wiper. I pulled it free and read the bold print. Notice: unauthorized vehicle. This vehicle is parked in violation of Westlake Estates community standards and will be towed at owner's expense if not removed within 24 hours. I looked around, confused. I was parked on my own property, not in someone's driveway or blocking a road. The notice included a phone number for the Westlake Homeowners Association. I took out my phone and called immediately. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. Westlake HOA. This is Sarah Wilson speaking. Hi, I'm calling about a towing notice that was put on my truck, I said, keeping my tone level despite my irritation. I'm parked on my own property off the gravel road. That's not possible, she said with immediate certainty. The access road belongs to the Westlake HOA, and we don't allow parking on it. Are you a resident here? No, I'm the owner of the 3-acre property that borders your neighborhood. I inherited it from my uncle, Robert Mitchell. There was a brief pause before Sarah responded with a laugh that got under my skin. Oh, you must be confused. That old gravel road is community property and has been for years. Your uncle allowed residents to use it as a courtesy, but it's maintained by our HOA. I don't think that's right, I said. The property was deeded to me, including the access road. Look, Mr. Mitchell, James Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, I've been president of this HOA for 5 years, and I can assure you that road is part of our community infrastructure. If you want to park there temporarily while visiting whatever land you inherited, you need to display a visitor pass, which I'd be happy to issue. Otherwise, I'll have to enforce our community standards. The conversation left me uneasy. I removed the notice from my windshield, got in my truck, and drove back to my apartment in Dallas. Something felt off about Sarah Wilson's dismissive tone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to bully me. The next day, I dug out the folder of documents I'd received from the lawyer. I'd barely looked at them before, assuming it was just a simple property transfer. Now, I spread everything across my dining table and began reading carefully. The more I read, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. The property deed clearly showed the boundaries of my uncle's land, which included not just the 3 acres with the shed and well, but also the gravel road cutting through the Westlake development. More surprisingly, a section at the neighborhood entrance where their welcome sign stood was also part of my property. I spent the next few days doing research, contacting the county records office, and even hiring a surveyor to verify the property lines. Everything confirmed what the original documents showed. The access road and entrance area legally belonged to me, not the HOA. Even more interesting was what I discovered about the well. A notation in my uncle's personal files mentioned that he had allowed the neighborhood to tap in for their irrigation needs. I found the connection point where they had hooked into his water supply for the sprinkler system that kept their entrance landscaping lush and green. There was no formal easement, no written agreement, nothing that legally transferred any rights to the HOA. My uncle had simply been a good neighbor, allowing informal use of his resources without surrendering his ownership. Armed with this information, I called Sarah Wilson back. This time, I was ready for her dismissive attitude. "Ms. Wilson, I've reviewed all the property documents and confirmed with the county that the access road and part of your neighborhood entrance are actually on my land. I also discovered that your irrigation system is connected to my well without any formal agreement." "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Those arrangements have been in place for years. Yes, by my uncle's goodwill, but never legally transferred. I'm not trying to cause problems, but I do expect an apology for the towing threat since I was parked on my own property." Instead of acknowledging her mistake, Sarah's voice turned cold. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't appreciate your tone or these baseless claims. If you continue making trouble, we'll be forced to take legal action. The Westlake HOA has considerable resources and experienced attorneys. I suggest you drop this matter immediately." Her threat hit like a splash of cold water, washing away any inclination I might have had toward neighborly compromise. If Sarah Wilson wanted a fight over what was rightfully mine, she would get one. I hung up the phone and began making a list of what I needed to do next. My uncle's modest inheritance had suddenly become much more interesting, and I wasn't about to let an overbearing HOA president bully me out of my property rights. After hanging up with Sarah Wilson, I called several attorneys in the Dallas area who specialized in land use and property rights. Most could only offer appointments weeks out, but Mark Peterson had a cancellation the next morning and agreed to see me. Mark's office occupied the corner of a renovated warehouse in downtown Dallas. The exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors gave it a modern feel, while the framed land surveys and property maps on the walls clearly announced his specialty. "So, let me get this straight," Mark said after I'd explained my situation. "You inherited 3 acres from your uncle, which includes an access road and the entrance to this Westlake subdivision. The HOA is using your well water for their landscaping, and when you parked on your own property, they threatened to tow your vehicle." Mark flipped through the documentation I'd brought, the property deed, survey records, and county records I'd gathered. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been a suppressed smile. "Mr. Mitchell, based on what I'm seeing here, your legal position is remarkably solid. Your uncle never granted any formal easements or rights to the HOA for either the road or the water access. What we have here is a classic case of permissive use that never converted to a legal right." "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means you have every right to control access to your property, including that road and water supply. The HOA has been benefiting from your uncle's goodwill without legal standing, and now they're threatening you over your legitimate property rights." Mark leaned back in his chair. "I assume you want to push back against this?" "I do. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I won't be bullied either." Mark nodded, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Here's what I suggest. First, we send a formal cease and desist letter establishing your ownership and demanding they stop making false claims about your property. Second, you might want to consider physically securing your boundaries to reinforce your rights. And third, we should discuss your long-term goals here. Do you want to sell the property, negotiate formal agreements with the HOA, or simply assert your boundaries?" "I hadn't thought that far ahead," I admitted. For now, I just want them to acknowledge my rights and stop the threats. Fair enough. Let's start there. I hired Mark on the spot. His rate wasn't cheap, but the confidence in his assessment made it worth every penny. He promised to have the cease and desist letter ready by the next day and suggested I survey the property again with an eye toward securing it. 2 days later, Mark and I watched as a courier delivered our letter to the Westlake HOA office. It laid out my ownership claims in precise legal language, included copies of all supporting documentation, and demanded they cease making false claims about my property. It also noted that any future access to my property for community purposes would require formal written agreements. "What now?" I asked as we walked back to our cars. "Now we let them sweat for a bit," Mark said. "But I'd also suggest you make your ownership physically clear. Property rights sometimes need visible reinforcement." I took his advice to heart. The following weekend, I rented a pickup truck and bought heavy-duty chains, locks, and no trespassing signs at a hardware store. By Saturday afternoon, I had installed steel posts on either side of the gravel road at my property line and stretched a chain between them, secured with a padlock. I posted prominent no trespassing signs that clearly stated private property of James Mitchell, along with my attorney's contact information. While I worked, several residents slowed their cars to stare at me. A few stopped and asked what I was doing. I explained politely but firmly that I was securing my private property and directed their questions to the HOA board. The last task was addressing the water issue. I followed the pipe from my uncle's well to where it connected with the HOA's irrigation system. A simple valve controlled the flow. I shut it off and secured it with another padlock. It took less than 5 minutes to cut off the water supply that had been keeping the Westlake entrance and community garden looking lush for years. Mark had warned me to expect backlash, but I wasn't prepared for how quickly the effects of my actions would hit the community. By Monday morning, the garbage collection company couldn't use their normal route through the gravel road. Their trucks were too large to navigate the narrower streets inside the subdivision, so they skipped collection entirely. School buses faced a similar problem. The road closure forced them to detour through the subdivision's winding streets, causing traffic jams that made parents late for work. I received this information from Mark, who was monitoring the situation through contacts he had in the area. The most visible impact came from shutting off the water. The Texas summer sun was merciless, and without irrigation, the carefully maintained flowers and shrubs at the Westlake entrance began to wilt within days. The community garden plots dried up, killing the vegetables residents had been growing. My phone rang constantly that week. I let most calls go to voicemail after recognizing the Westlake HOA number. Sarah Wilson's messages grew increasingly frantic, starting with cold demands that I cease this childish behavior immediately, and evolving to nearly pleading tones asking me to be reasonable and think about the community. I didn't respond directly to any of her calls. Instead, I followed Mark's advice and directed all communication to him. This clearly frustrated Sarah, whose messages began to include personal attacks on my character. On Thursday evening, about 10 days after blocking the road, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Is this James Mitchell?" a woman's voice asked, speaking quietly. "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name is Emily Brooks. I'm on the Westlake HOA board, but I'm calling you in private. Is this a good time to talk?" Her tone was different from Sarah's, earnest rather than demanding. I was curious enough to continue the conversation. "I can talk. What's this about?" "There are things you should know about this situation with your property," she said, still speaking softly as if worried about being overheard. "Sarah isn't being honest with the board or the residents." I grabbed a notepad. "I'm listening." 3 years ago, when I first joined the board, I found some documents in our files that made it clear your uncle owned that road and the entrance area. I brought it to Sarah's attention and she told me she'd handle it. "And did she?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "No, she buried it. She told me it would be expensive for the HOA to secure formal access rights and that it was better to just continue as things had been. She made me promise not to bring it up again, said it would cause unnecessary panic among residents. I wrote this down, feeling a surge of vindication. So, she's known all this time? Yes, and there's more. Last year, when your uncle passed away, she specifically told the board not to reach out to his family. She said she had it on good authority that the new owner wouldn't change anything. She's been deliberately concealing this from everyone. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Emily sighed. Because what she's doing isn't right. She's lying to the whole community, blaming you for suddenly causing problems when she's known about this issue for years. People are getting angry, but they're angry at the wrong person. I thought about this for a moment. Would you be willing to put this in writing? I'm afraid of what would happen if Sarah found out I talked to you, Emily admitted. She can make life difficult for people who cross her, but I couldn't stay silent anymore. I understand. Thank you for calling. After Emily hung up, I immediately called Mark and relayed the conversation. He was as interested as I was in this new information. This changes things, he said. If the HOA president knowingly misled residents and concealed material facts from them that could constitute breach of fiduciary duty, the residents might have grounds to take action against her, not just you. Meanwhile, conditions in Westlake continued to deteriorate. Without garbage collection, trash began piling up at the community's collection points. The landscaping crews couldn't access their normal equipment storage area, which delayed lawn maintenance throughout the neighborhood. The once pristine community entrance had become an eyesore of dead plants and dried mud. Sarah sent out a community email, which Mark obtained from a contact living in Westlake, explaining these issues as temporary infrastructure challenges that the board was working diligently to resolve. She made no mention of my property rights or the true cause of these problems. Residents were getting restless. Social media discussions in the community group grew heated, with people demanding answers about why their monthly dues weren't securing basic services. Photos circulated of children trying to play soccer on overgrown fields and the community garden reduced to dried stalks and cracked earth. In one particularly telling photo, someone had placed a sign next to the wilted entrance display that read, $350 monthly dues for this? The image was shared hundreds of times among local residents. I felt conflicted watching the community suffer. I hadn't wanted to punish the residents. My quarrel was with Sarah and her underhanded tactics. But Mark assured me that maintaining clear boundaries now would lead to a more equitable solution later. If you back down without a formal agreement, you'll just be setting yourself up for more problems, he explained. Sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better. By the end of the second week, the situation had reached a breaking point. The community that once prided itself on immaculate grounds and premium services now struggled with basic functions. Garbage overflowed from collection points, creating health concerns. Lawns grew wild, and the once beautiful entrance stood as a brown, withered testament to the ongoing dispute. Sarah's calls to me stopped entirely after I forwarded her latest voicemail to Mark, who responded with a stern warning about potential harassment claims. Instead, she shifted to a new approach, having individual board members try to contact me with various compromise offers, none of which acknowledged my legal rights or offered fair compensation. Emily called me once more to report that an emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled for the following week. Sarah had finally been forced to address the true nature of the problem with the residents, though Emily suspected she would still try to paint me as the villain. People are furious, Emily told me, not just about the services failing, but about how the board has handled communication. They want answers, and I don't think Sarah can keep dodging the truth. I thanked her again for the inside information and hung up, feeling that a turning point was approaching. The carefully maintained facade of Westlake Estates had cracked, revealing the consequences of Sarah's deception and the board's negligence. As residents looked at their deteriorating neighborhood and questioned what their substantial monthly dues were paying for, The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the future of my property rights, but potentially the leadership of the entire community. The West Lake Community Center buzzed with tension as I slipped into a seat in the back row. Nearly every chair was filled, with some residents standing along the walls. The emergency HOA meeting had drawn a much larger crowd than their regular monthly gatherings, according to Emily's text messages updating me on the situation. I kept my head down, not wanting to draw attention just yet. Mark sat beside me, legal documents neatly arranged in his briefcase. Up front, Sarah Wilson stood at a podium, her usual polished appearance looking slightly frayed around the edges. Her voice carried through the room as she tried to maintain control of the increasingly restless crowd. As I've stated in my communications, we're dealing with a temporary infrastructure challenge that the board is working diligently to resolve, she said, using the same vague language from her emails. I know the past 2 weeks have been difficult, but I assure you we're exploring all options to restore services. Hands shot up across the room. Sarah pointed to a middle-aged man in the front row. "It's been 2 weeks since garbage collection stopped," he said. "My kids can't even play in the backyard because of the smell from the collection point. What exactly is this infrastructure challenge you keep referring to?" Sarah's smile tightened. "There's an access issue with one of our service roads that's affected garbage pickup and landscaping crews. We're in discussions to resolve it." "That's not what I heard," called out a woman from the middle of the room without waiting to be recognized. "My husband works for the garbage company. He said someone chained off the road and they can't get their trucks through anymore." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah tapped her microphone. "Please, if we could maintain order—" "Is it true our water's been cut off too?" someone else shouted. "The entrance looks like a desert and the community garden is dead." The room erupted with voices. I watched as Sarah tried to regain control, rapping her knuckles on the podium. Her face flushed red with either anger or embarrassment, maybe both. "If you'll allow me to finish, why wasn't any of this mentioned in the last 3 board emails?" A heavy-set man stood up near the front, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You told us these were temporary issues. Now we learn someone's blocked the road and cut our water? Who did this, and why aren't we taking legal action?" Sarah cleared her throat. "The board is handling the situation, Mr. Harris." "My name is Thomas," the man corrected, "and I don't think you are handling it. My monthly dues are $350, and I can't even get my garbage picked up or my lawn mowed. I want straight answers." "As I said, we're in discussions with the relevant party." Thomas Harris cut her off. "Who exactly is this relevant party, and why does he think he can block our road?" I felt a tap on my shoulder as Mark leaned in. "This is going south for her quickly," he whispered. I nodded, watching the scene unfold. Sarah adjusted her blazer. "There's a property owner adjacent to our community who has made certain claims." "Claims about what?" Thomas pressed. "About ownership of the access road and certain water rights," Sarah admitted, her voice growing smaller. "Did you check who owned that land before threatening him?" Thomas asked directly, his voice resonating through the now silent room. Sarah's mouth opened and closed without sound. The room waited. I leaned forward slightly, curious how she'd respond. "The board has been aware of some questions regarding the boundary lines," she finally said. "How long have you known about this?" someone called out. "That's not the issue right now," Sarah deflected. "The issue is restoring services." Emily Brooks stood up from her seat at the board table. 3 years, she said clearly. "The board has known about this ownership question for 3 years. I discovered the documents myself." The room exploded with voices. I watched as Sarah turned to Emily, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. "Emily, this is not the appropriate forum." "I disagree," Emily said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "The residents deserve to know why their services have been cut off. They're paying for transparency." "So, you've known for 3 years that we don't own that road?" Thomas demanded, pointing at Sarah. "And you did nothing about it?" Sarah's composed facade crumbled further. The situation was under control until recently. Under control? Another resident shouted. You mean you were just hoping the owner would never find out what you were doing with his property? Sarah's knuckles whitened as she gripped the podium. This is becoming unproductive. Perhaps we should adjourn and— So you threatened to tow the actual owner's vehicle when he parked on his own property, Thomas interrupted. Is that why we're in this mess? Heads turned as people looked at each other, murmuring louder now. The scene was quickly slipping beyond Sarah's control. I did what I thought was best for this community, Sarah snapped. The board decided years ago that formalizing these arrangements would be too expensive. You mean the board knew? Someone called. Not all of us, Emily clarified, and those who did were told not to discuss it. Sarah shot Emily a venomous look. I can see that this meeting has been hijacked by those with personal agendas. As president, I'm calling for— Is the owner here? Thomas interrupted, looking around the room. I'd like to hear his side. Mark nudged me gently. I took a deep breath and stood up. I am, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent as heads turned toward me. My name is James Mitchell. I inherited the property from my uncle, Robert Mitchell. Sarah's face went pale. This is outrageous. You have no right to be at a private HOA meeting. Actually, Mark said, standing beside me, as the affected property owner in an open discussion about his land, he has every right to hear how his property is being discussed. And who are you? Sarah demanded. Mark Peterson, land use attorney, he replied calmly. Mr. Mitchell, Thomas Harris said, turning to face me, would you mind telling us your version of events? I nodded and stepped into the center aisle. 3 months ago, I visited the property I inherited from my uncle. While parked on my own land, I received a towing notice from the HOA. When I called to question this, Ms. Wilson informed me that the road wasn't mine. She was incorrect. Can you prove ownership? Someone asked. Mark opened his briefcase and removed a folder. We have copies of the property deed, survey records, and county documentation for anyone who wishes to review them. Sarah's voice turned shrill. This is highly inappropriate. The board will address this privately with Mr. Mitchell's attorney. Why? Thomas challenged. So you can hide more information from us? I want to see those documents. Other voices joined in agreement. Mark walked to the front table and spread out the paperwork. The property boundaries are clearly defined here, he explained as residents gathered around. The deed shows Mr. Mitchell owns not only the 3 acres with the shed and well, but also the gravel access road and a portion of the subdivision entrance where your sign stands. And what about our water? A woman asked. I spoke up. The irrigation system for your entrance landscaping and community garden has been connected to my uncle's well for years. He allowed this informally, but no legal agreement was ever created. So Sarah knew all along that we were using someone else's water and road without permission? Thomas asked, looking directly at the HOA president. Sarah's composure finally broke. You don't understand the financial implications. Securing formal easements would have required raising dues significantly. So you lied to us instead, a resident shouted. I protected this community's interests, Sarah shot back. By hiding information and threatening the legal property owner, Thomas countered. That's not protection, that's negligence. Calls for Sarah's resignation erupted from around the room. Her face contorted with rage as she pointed at me. He's the one who cut off our services. He's holding this community hostage. After you threatened him with towing and legal action, Emily pointed out, for parking on his own property. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some residents were shouting at Sarah, others were examining the documents Mark had provided, and a few were approaching me with questions. The remaining board members tried unsuccessfully to restore order. Finally, Thomas Harris stood on a chair and whistled loudly, cutting through the noise. Enough, he called out. This isn't solving anything. Mr. Mitchell, what would it take to resolve this situation? We have kids who need to get to school and garbage that needs to be collected." All eyes turned to me. I looked at Mark, who nodded slightly. "I'm open to negotiating formal agreements for road access and water usage," I said. "I never wanted to disrupt your community. I just wanted my property rights respected." "Then why block the road and cut the water?" someone called out. "Because when I tried to discuss this with Ms. Wilson, she threatened me with legal action and refused to acknowledge my ownership," I explained. "My attorney advised me to establish clear boundaries before negotiating." Emily stepped forward. "I move that we vote immediately to enter into good faith negotiations with Mr. Mitchell to restore services as quickly as possible." A formal vote was hastily organized. The result was overwhelming. All but a handful of residents voted to pursue immediate negotiations. Sarah didn't participate in the vote, standing rigidly at the podium as her authority crumbled around her. After the vote, Mark and I agreed to a preliminary meeting with the board the following day to discuss temporary service restoration while formal agreements were drafted. As we were leaving, Emily caught up with us in the parking lot. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "It wasn't fair how this was handled." "What happens now with the board?" I asked. Emily sighed. "There's already talk of a special election. Several members have called for Sarah's resignation. I can't say more than that, but things are changing quickly." 2 weeks later, I sat across from Emily Brooks in a conference room at Mark's office. Emily was now serving as interim HOA president, and beside her sat the HOA's attorney, a serious-looking woman named Patricia Welch. The atmosphere was professional, but noticeably less hostile than my previous interactions with Westlake's leadership. "Thank you for meeting with us today," Emily began. "We've reviewed your proposed terms and are prepared to discuss them in detail." I nodded and let Mark take the lead in presenting our formal proposal. The terms were straightforward. Shrewd $200 monthly for road access, $800 for water usage from my well, a printed apology to be distributed to all residents explaining the situation accurately, and a clause stating that the agreement would terminate immediately if any harassment or interference with my property occurred. "The monthly fees are non-negotiable," Mark explained. "They represent fair market value for the services provided. The 10-year contract includes annual increases tied to inflation." Patricia reviewed the documents, occasionally whispering to Emily. Finally, she spoke up. "The financial terms are higher than we anticipated, but given the circumstances, they're not unreasonable. Our main concern is the immediate termination clause. We'd prefer to include a remediation period for any potential issues." Mark shook his head. "Given the previous hostility Mr. Mitchell experienced, the immediate termination clause stays. However, we're willing to add language requiring written notice of any violations before termination." The negotiation continued for about an hour, with minor adjustments to the wording but no substantial changes to the core terms. By the end, we had a complete agreement that satisfied all parties. "We'll present this to the residents at next week's meeting," Emily said. "But the board has been granted authority to finalize this agreement, so your approval today is sufficient to move forward." Patricia nodded. "I believe this serves the community's interests while respecting Mr. Mitchell's property rights. I'll recommend approval." Emily signed the documents on behalf of the HOA, and I added my signature. Just like that, a conflict that had caused weeks of disruption was formally resolved. "Sarah resigned this morning," Emily mentioned as we were gathering our papers. "Between this situation and some other concerns about financial management that have come to light, she decided to step down rather than face a recall vote." I wasn't surprised. "What happens with the HOA leadership now?" "I'll serve as interim president until the special election next month," Emily explained. "Most of the board is staying on, and we're committed to more transparent operations moving forward." By the end of the month, life in Westlake Estates had largely returned to normal. Garbage trucks once again rumbled down the gravel road, school buses followed their regular routes, and the landscaping crews were back at work. The monthly checks started arriving punctually in my account, and I used part of the first payment to upgrade the well pump to better handle the increased demand. The printed apology that had been part of our agreement was distributed to all residents, laying out the facts of the situation without placing blame. Still, word had spread about Sarah's dishonesty, and I heard through Emily that she had put her house on the market and was planning to move out of the community. I visited the property regularly now, sometimes just to check on things, other times to work on clearing some of the overgrown areas or making improvements to the shed. Uncle Robert would have approved, I thought, of how I'd protected what was mine while finding a solution that worked for everyone. One Saturday afternoon, as I was driving past the Westlake entrance, I noticed that the landscaping had been fully restored. New flowers bloomed in carefully maintained beds, and the sprinkler system, now legally connected to my well, kept everything lush and green. The community garden had been replanted, with vegetables already beginning to sprout in the summer sun. Seeing the tangible results of standing my ground gave me a sense of satisfaction. My uncle's modest inheritance had become both a financial windfall and a powerful lesson about property rights and the importance of not backing down to bullies. As I turned onto the gravel road that cut through the heart of Westlake Estates, my gravel road, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes justice came with a monthly payment plan, and in this case it was paying quite well indeed.